The fluorescent lights in the grocery store security office were too bright, and they made the handcuffs around Margaret Chen's wrists look even more unforgivable. She sat perfectly still in the plastic chair, her back straight despite 92 years of gravity, her hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for church to start. The store manager stood against the wall, arms crossed, face hard. The security guard who'd caught her was filling out paperwork. And Officer David Martinez, 28 years old and 6 months out of the academy, stood in the doorway, staring at a woman who weighed maybe 90 pounds, who was wearing a coat that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to identify, whose eyes were focused on the floor like she was trying to memorize the pattern in the linoleum. On the table between them sat the evidence: one turkey sandwich, pre-made, plastic-wrapped, price tag still attached. $4.99. Officer Martinez had been trained for a lot of situations: domestic disputes, traffic stops, armed robberies. But nobody had trained him for this. Nobody had told him what to do when the crime was so small it fit in the palm of your hand, and the criminal looked like she should be someone's grandmother, not someone's arrest. And what he did next, in the 43 seconds of silence that followed, would split that grocery store, that police department, and eventually that entire town into people who believed the law was the law, and people who believed that sometimes the law was the furthest thing from justice. 7 months earlier, Margaret Chen's apartment smelled like jasmine tea and old photographs, the kind of smell that clings to a place when someone's lived there for decades and every object has a memory attached. She'd moved into the efficiency unit on the 3rd floor of the Parkview Arms in 1978, back when her husband was still alive and her daughter was still in college, and the building was new enough that the elevator worked most of the time. Now the elevator was broken more often than not, and Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, stopping at each landing to catch her breath. Her knees hurt, her hip hurt. Everything hurt, in small, constant ways that she'd learned to ignore because complaining about pain didn't make it go away. It just made you tiresome to be around. She lived on $843 a month, Social Security. Her husband had worked for the railroad for 37 years, and when he died, she'd gotten survivor benefits that were supposed to be enough, and maybe they would have been in 1995. But it was 2024 now, and $843 didn't stretch the way it used to. Rent was $620. That left $223 for everything else: electricity, water, phone, food, medicine. Margaret had learned to be creative. She kept the heat off until November, wearing sweaters indoors, sleeping under 3 blankets. She unplugged everything when she wasn't using it. She made 1 bag of rice last 2 weeks. She bought day-old bread from the discount rack. She took her blood pressure medication every other day instead of every day because the prescription cost $60 a month and she couldn't afford to refill it as often as the doctor said she should. Her daughter, Susan, lived in Seattle. She called once a week, always on Sunday afternoons, and always asked the same question: "Are you okay, Mom? Do you need anything?" And Margaret always gave the same answer: "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me." Because Susan had her own problems: a mortgage, 2 teenagers, a husband who'd been laid off 6 months ago and was still looking for work. Margaret wasn't going to add to that burden, wasn't going to be the kind of mother who became a problem her children had to solve. She'd raised Susan to be independent, to be strong, to take care of herself, and Margaret was going to practice what she'd preached, even if it meant going to bed hungry some nights. She'd worked her whole life, 43 years as a seamstress, first in a factory, and then after the factory closed, taking in alterations from home, hemming pants, taking in dresses, fixing torn seams. Her fingers had been nimble once, quick and precise, but arthritis had bent them into shapes that didn't quite close anymore, and threading a needle took 5 minutes now instead of 5 seconds. She'd stopped taking clients 2 years ago. Couldn't keep up. Couldn't promise the work would be done on time or done well, and Margaret Chen, who had built her reputation on reliability, wasn't going to ruin it by delivering subpar work just because she needed the money. So she lived small. She watched television shows she'd seen a dozen times because cable was a luxury she'd canceled. She read books from the library, walking the 8 blocks there and back, even when her hips screamed, because the library was free and books were the one thing that could still take her somewhere else. She had friends in the building, other elderly tenants who were living on the same tight margins, and they'd have coffee together in the lobby sometimes, sharing one pot among 4 people, stretching it until it was more memory of coffee than actual coffee. They talked about their children, their grandchildren, the world that was moving faster than they could follow. And they didn't talk about the hard parts, about the bills they couldn't pay, about the meals they skipped, about the fear that lived in the back of everything, the fear of getting sick, of falling, of something breaking that they couldn't afford to fix. Margaret had always been proud. Not arrogant, just proud in the way people who've earned their independence are proud. She didn't want pity, didn't want charity, didn't want to be treated like she was helpless just because she was old. And so when things got hard, she got quiet. She stopped mentioning when her hip hurt, stopped talking about the prescription she couldn't afford, stopped saying she was hungry. She just kept going, kept climbing those stairs, kept living in that small apartment with the jasmine tea and the old photographs, kept pretending that $843 a month was enough. But by March, it wasn't pretending anymore. It was something closer to desperation. She'd run out of food on the Tuesday. Not completely, she had rice. She had tea, but the rice was almost gone, and she didn't have money for more until her Social Security check came through on Friday. 3 days. She could make it 3 days. She'd made it through worse. She could drink tea and tell her stomach to be quiet and sleep as much as possible because sleeping meant not thinking about hunger. But Wednesday morning she woke up dizzy, stood up from bed, and the room tilted sideways and she had to grab the nightstand to keep from falling. Her hands shook, her vision blurred, and she knew, in the way you know things about your own body after 92 years of living in it, that something was wrong. She should eat something, needed to eat something, but the rice was gone. She'd finished it the night before, a small bowl with salt because she didn't have butter or soy sauce or anything else to make it taste like more than just survival. She checked the cupboards anyway, hoping she'd forgotten something, hoping there was a can of soup or a package of crackers hidden in the back, but the cupboards were bare. Literally bare. The tea was there, the salt, some expired spices she kept because throwing things away felt wasteful, but no food. Margaret sat down at her small kitchen table and tried to think. She could call Susan, ask for help, but it was Wednesday morning in Seattle, which meant Susan was at work, and Margaret didn't want to interrupt her daughter's day with this, didn't want Susan to worry, didn't want to be the kind of burden that required emergency wire transfers and panicked phone calls. She could ask one of her friends in the building, but they were all in the same situation, all living on the same thin edge. She could go to a food bank, but the closest one was across town and she didn't have bus fare, and walking that far feeling like this didn't seem possible. So she did what she'd been taught never to do. She walked to the grocery store 6 blocks from her apartment, the one with the bright lights and the automatic doors and the security cameras in every aisle. She walked slowly, stopping twice to rest, her hip aching, her head still dizzy, and when she got there, she stood in the prepared food section, staring at the sandwiches under their heat lamps and plastic wrapping, and she thought about how easy it would be. How small a sandwich was, how many sandwiches that store sold every day, hundreds probably, thousands. How one missing sandwich wouldn't hurt anyone. She'd never stolen anything in her life, never even considered it. Her parents had raised her to believe that integrity meant doing the right thing even when no one was watching, even when it was hard, even when you were desperate. But she was so hungry, and so dizzy, and so tired of being strong.
Margaret picked up a turkey sandwich. It was small, just white bread and sliced turkey and a little lettuce, wrapped in clear plastic with a price sticker on top, $4.99. She held it in her hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the warmth from the heat lamp. Then she looked around, saw that the aisle was empty, and slipped the sandwich into her coat pocket. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might give out right there. Her hands shook worse than they had that morning. She walked toward the exit, moving as normally as she could, trying not to look suspicious, trying not to look like someone who just committed a crime. She was 10 feet from the door when the security guard stepped in front of her. "Ma'am?" he said. He was young, maybe 30, with a bored expression that didn't change even when he asked her to come with him. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." Margaret stopped walking. She didn't run, didn't argue, didn't pretend she didn't know what he was talking about. She just nodded, her face burning with shame, and followed him to the back of the store. The security office was small and windowless and smelled like stale coffee. The guard made her empty her pockets. She pulled out the sandwich, set it on the table, and sat down when he told her to sit. He called the store manager. The store manager looked at Margaret, looked at the sandwich, and shook his head like she'd personally offended him. He said they had a zero-tolerance policy. Said theft was theft, regardless of age or circumstance. Said he was calling the police. Margaret didn't say anything. What could she say? That she was hungry? That she was desperate? That she hadn't meant to become this person, someone who stole food? None of it would matter. The law was the law, and she'd broken it. Officer Martinez arrived 20 minutes later. He was young, younger than the security guard, with dark hair and tired eyes, and a uniform that still looked too new. He took one look at Margaret sitting in that chair, hands folded, face blank, and something in his chest tightened. The manager explained the situation, showed him the sandwich, said he wanted to press charges, said they couldn't just let people steal, it would set a precedent. Officer Martinez listened, nodded, did what he was supposed to do. He read Margaret her rights, asked her ID, filled out the report. And then, because policy required it, because the manager was insisting, because the system demanded it, he put handcuffs on a 92-year-old woman for stealing a $5 sandwich. Margaret didn't resist, didn't cry, just let him cuff her hands in front of her because cuffing them behind her would have hurt her shoulders too much. And Officer Martinez felt something crack inside him, something that made him look at the manager and say, "Is this really necessary?" And the manager, crossing his arms tighter, said, "Yes, rules are rules." But Officer Martinez was thinking about his own grandmother, about the woman who'd raised him after his parents died, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep him fed and clothed and in school, who was 78 now and living in a nursing home because her Social Security wasn't enough and he couldn't afford to take care of her full time. He was thinking about the system that had let his grandmother slip through the cracks, and he was thinking that if rules were rules, then the rules were broken. He walked Margaret out to his patrol car. The store manager and security guard watched from the doorway, making sure she was actually arrested, making sure their policy was enforced. Officer Martinez opened the back door of the car, helped Margaret inside, and closed the door gently. Then he got in the driver's seat, started the engine, and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Margaret's voice came from the back seat, quiet and trembling. "I'm sorry. I've never done anything like this before." Officer Martinez looked at her in the rearview mirror. "When did you last eat?" Margaret hesitated. "Sunday." It was Wednesday. Officer Martinez didn't say anything. He just pulled out of the parking lot, but instead of driving toward the police station, he turned in the opposite direction. Margaret noticed, but didn't ask where they were going. She just sat there, hands cuffed in her lap, watching the buildings go by. He pulled into the parking lot of a diner 3 blocks away, a place called Rosie's, with peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered. He got out, opened Margaret's door, helped her out of the car. She looked at him, confused. He said, "We're going to get you some food, then we'll figure out the rest." Inside, the diner smelled like bacon and coffee and pancakes, and Margaret's stomach twisted with hunger so intense it hurt. Officer Martinez chose a booth in the back, away from the windows. He unlocked the handcuffs, slipped them back onto his belt. The waitress came over, looked at Margaret, looked at Officer Martinez in his uniform, and didn't ask questions, just took their order. Officer Martinez ordered eggs, toast, bacon, orange juice, coffee, told the waitress to bring extra of everything. While they waited, he asked Margaret questions.
Not interrogation questions, just questions. Where do you live? Do you have family? When did things get hard? And Margaret, who hadn't talked to anyone honestly about her situation in months, maybe years, started to answer. She told him about her apartment, about her husband and her daughter, about the $843 a month, about the prescriptions she couldn't afford, about skipping meals so she could pay rent, about the shame of it all, the humiliation of being 92 years old and not being able to feed herself. Officer Martinez listened, and when the food came, he pushed the plate toward her and said, "Eat, please." Margaret looked at the food, at the eggs and bacon and toast and the little cup of jelly and the steam rising from the coffee, and she started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears running down her face while she picked up a fork with shaking hands and took a bite of scrambled eggs. They were the best things she'd ever tasted, or maybe she was just that hungry. She ate slowly, deliberately, and Officer Martinez sat across from her, drinking his coffee, not saying anything. When she finished, he paid the bill. Then he drove to a grocery store. Not the one she'd been arrested at, a different one. He went inside and came back 10 minutes later with 3 bags of groceries: rice, bread, peanut butter, canned soup, fruit, milk, things that would last, things she could eat. He put them in the trunk and drove her home. At her building, he carried the bags up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken. Margaret unlocked her door, and Officer Martinez set the groceries on her small kitchen counter. Then he turned to her and said, "I'm not going to file the report." Margaret stared at him. "But the manager—" "The manager isn't here," Officer Martinez said, "and I'm the one who decides what gets reported. As far as I'm concerned, this was a misunderstanding. You put the sandwich in your pocket, meaning to pay for it, and forgot. It happens." He paused. "But here's the thing. This can't happen again. Not because I won't help you, but because next time it might not be me who responds. So I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If you need food, you call me." He pulled a card from his pocket, wrote his personal cell number on the back, handed it to her. "You call me, and I'll make sure you get what you need. There are programs, food banks, resources. I'll help you navigate them, but you don't steal. Deal?" Margaret took the card, her hands still shaking, and nodded. "Why are you doing this?" "Because my grandmother would want someone to do this for her," Officer Martinez said, "and because you're not a criminal. You're just someone who got lost in a system that doesn't care about people like you. And that's not right." He left before Margaret could say anything else, and she stood in her apartment, surrounded by bags of groceries she hadn't bought, holding a card with a phone number written on it, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Officer Martinez didn't forget about Margaret. He called her the next day, asked how she was doing, if she needed anything. He connected her with a social worker who helped her apply for SNAP benefits, which she hadn't known she qualified for. He found a program that helped low-income seniors with prescription costs. He even arranged for a volunteer from a local church to check on her once a week, just to make sure she was okay. And Margaret, who had spent so long being too proud to ask for help, learned that accepting help wasn't weakness, it was survival. But the story didn't stay quiet. The waitress at Rosie's had recognized Officer Martinez's uniform and Margaret's age and the way they were sitting together, and she'd mentioned it to her husband, who mentioned it to a friend who happened to be a reporter for the local paper. The reporter made some calls, found out about the incident at the grocery store, found out that there was no arrest record, no charges filed, found out that a young police officer had apparently let a shoplifter go and then bought her groceries.
The article ran 2 weeks later. It was titled, "Officer Shows Mercy to Elderly Woman Caught Stealing Food," and it split the town exactly the way Officer Martinez had known it would. Some people praised him, called him a hero, said he'd shown compassion in a system that had forgotten how. But others were furious, said he'd failed to do his job, said he'd set a dangerous precedent, said if cops could just decide which laws to enforce based on their feelings, then what was the point of having laws at all?
The police department called him in. His sergeant, a man named Reynolds, who'd been on the force for 23 years, sat him down in an office and asked him to explain himself. Officer Martinez told the truth, told him about Margaret, about her age, her situation, the fact that she'd been living on nothing and had simply been desperate, told him that arresting her would have accomplished nothing except ruining what was left of her life. And Sergeant Reynolds listened. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, I should write you up for this." "I know," Officer Martinez said, "but I'm not going to." Officer Martinez looked up, surprised. Sergeant Reynolds sighed. "Because 20 years ago, I would have done the same thing. Maybe I should do it now more often. The law isn't supposed to be a hammer. It's supposed to be a tool. And tools are only useful if you know when to use them and when to put them down." He paused. "But here's the problem. That store manager is pissed. He's talking about filing a complaint, says you made him look bad. So this isn't over." And it wasn't. The store manager did file a complaint. The story got bigger. A news station picked it up. And suddenly, Officer David Martinez, who'd just been trying to do the right thing, was at the center of a debate about justice and mercy, and whether the law applied equally to everyone or whether some people deserved exceptions. Margaret watched all of it from her apartment, horrified that her mistake had caused so much trouble for the young officer who'd saved her. She wanted to help but didn't know how, until a lawyer reached out, a woman named Patricia Voss, who specialized in elder law and had seen the news coverage. She offered to represent Margaret for free, and more than that, she wanted to go after the grocery store, wanted to highlight their policy of prosecuting elderly shoplifters for minor theft, wanted to shine a light on the conditions that had led Margaret to steal in the first place. Margaret wasn't sure. She didn't want more attention, didn't want to be a symbol or a cause. But Patricia Voss was persuasive. She said, "This isn't just about you. It's about every elderly person in this country who's living in poverty and being ignored. And if we don't speak up, nothing changes." So, Margaret agreed. The lawsuit didn't seek money. It sought policy change. It demanded that the grocery store chain implement a compassion protocol for cases involving elderly or obviously impoverished shoplifters, not to excuse theft, but to offer resources, connect people with social services, treat them like human beings instead of criminals. And it demanded that they drop any pursuit of charges or complaints against Officer Martinez. The case made national news. People started talking about elder poverty in ways they hadn't before, about the fact that millions of seniors were living on incomes that hadn't kept pace with inflation, about the gaps in the social safety net, about the cruelty of a system that would handcuff a 92-year-old woman over a sandwich. Donations poured in for Margaret, more than she could possibly use. She set up a fund, similar to what James Crawford had done in another town, another story, another fight against a system that had forgotten its humanity. She called it the Second Chances Fund, and it helped elderly people in crisis, paying for groceries, for prescriptions, for rent, for the small things that made the difference between surviving and suffering.
Officer Martinez was cleared of any wrongdoing. The police department, under pressure from the public and from advocacy groups, issued a statement supporting his actions. And the grocery store chain, facing boycotts and bad press, agreed to the policy changes. They even issued a public apology to Margaret. She didn't know if it was sincere, but it was something. 6 months later, on a Sunday afternoon, Officer Martinez stopped by Margaret's apartment. Not as a cop, just as a friend. She made tea, the jasmine kind, and they sat at her small kitchen table and talked about everything and nothing. About how her daughter had flown in for a visit, about how the fund was helping people, about how he'd been promoted, about how strange it was that a $5 sandwich had changed so many lives. Margaret looked at him over her teacup and said, "You saved me. You know that, don't you?" Officer Martinez shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just didn't let the system finish what it was trying to do."
They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Margaret said, "I think about that day a lot, about what would have happened if you'd just done your job, if you'd taken me to the station, processed me, let me become another statistic." Officer Martinez looked down at his hands. "I think about it too, and I'm glad I didn't." Margaret reached across the table, put her hand over his. "Me too." When Officer Martinez left that afternoon, walking down the 3 flights of stairs, because the elevator was still broken more often than not, he thought about all the Margaret Chens out there. All the people who were one bad day, one empty cupboard, one desperate decision away from becoming criminals in a system that had no room for their stories. And he thought about how many of them he'd never meet, never help, never save. But he'd saved one, and that one had saved others, and maybe that was how change happened. Not all at once, not in some grand, sweeping reform, but one person at a time, one moment of mercy at a time, one decision to see the human being instead of just the crime. Margaret lived another 3 years after that day in the grocery store. She died peacefully in her sleep, in her apartment, on the 3rd floor of the Parkview Arms, surrounded by photographs and the smell of jasmine tea. She was 95, and at her funeral, which was attended by her daughter and her grandchildren and dozens of people she'd helped through the Second Chances Fund, Officer David Martinez stood in the back and cried, because she'd taught him something important, that the law was meant to protect people, not punish them for being human, and that sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was refuse to follow orders that had forgotten their purpose. If you want more stories about people who chose compassion over rules, who saw the humanity in situations where others only saw policy, feel free to like this video. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And here's my question for you. What would you have done if you were Officer Martinez? Would you have arrested Margaret, or would you have done what he did? Have you ever had to choose between following the rules and doing what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations matter, and your perspective matters. And the only way we change systems that have forgotten their humanity is by remembering our own.